welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your time outside in the beautiful weather and the stunning views and the good food. Right now we have a panel on comics of displacement as a critical tool in teaching, research, dissemination, and challenging gender norms. On this panel, we have, let me just get my papers together. We have Bita Baroulizadeh. She's Iranian American, and she's a historian, editor, and artist. She has a doctorate in the history of race and racism in modern Iran. She's an assistant professor at the Department of History and Africana Studies at Bucknell University. Bita is not with us today, but she has recorded her wonderful talk. So I will have it projected. It's precisely timed, so there's no going over with the time. Bita gives a class at her university in the history of the conflicts in the Middle East through comics. So I think she was a very interesting person to present. Let me just go to the desktop. Okay. Okay, so we can't talk to Bita to slow down or speed up, so I'm going to run it. Does it sound okay? And if you can, please, if you can just ask to reduce the lighting here. So yes, thank you so much. Already done. Is this not? Okay, so.
Hello, everyone.
Yes, it just takes time. Give her time.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today and for accommodating the fact that this is a recording. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to be there in person, although I really wanted to be, and I feel so left out from what I'm sure is an amazing conversation. I just want to thank Dr. Lina Ghaiba for inviting me and Ms. Hara Kanman for making such wonderful arrangements for me that I wasn't able to take advantage of. And of course, thank you to the entire Sawaf Institute team. My talk for you today is based on my own experiences incorporating comics into my teaching. I am a historian by training. And for those of you familiar with history as a discipline, there's quite a bit of emphasis on textual sources. By textual sources, I mean newspapers, memoirs, treaties, government letters, personal letters, and so on. The visual really does take a back seat in history as a whole, not only in our research, but in our teaching as well. Because there is less of an interest in taking the visual seriously, I wanted to create a class that really did take it seriously. In a way, I wanted to create an anti-history class, not only in content, but also bucking the idea of chronology altogether. What I did was that I created a course on the modern Middle East in the late 20th and into the 21st century, but backwards. I began with the Tahrir protests and the Egyptian Revolution of 2011, and then moved backwards in time to the Iranian Revolution in 1979, and then the Lebanese Civil War, and then finally back to the Palestinian Nakba, and that's where we ended. Each of these historical moments had a graphic novel or memoir that grounded it for our class. First, Shireen Hamdi and Coleman Nye's Lissa, then Marjan Satrapi's Persepolis, and then Zainab Abi Rashid's A Game for Swallows, and finally Layla Abdul Razak's Badawi. The visual, in this case the illustrated graphics, was the primary vehicle for understanding the history. I included other sources, of course textual, but they were really secondary to the class. The books were really the primary source and vehicle for understanding this history. I structured the class in this way because I wanted to begin with something that would have been at least familiar to my students. These students were mostly freshmen, although not all, and so they were born mostly around the year 2000, 2001. And so I wanted to start with something that they had lived through not too many years ago, something that they would have seen on the television and had some level of familiarity with, even if it was just to say, oh yeah, I saw that on the news. And then I wanted to gradually build on that and introduce them to events that might seem further away. Because their skills in reading graphic novels would have gradually grown stronger, that distance would have been at least partially eliminated, and they would have been able to connect with stories of past decades from before when they were born at the very least. And so I wanted to introduce a historical literacy to them through the visual and the graphic that first built on their own intimacy with events and then developed a new intimacy altogether. I structured the class in this way because of two things. First, I knew undoubtedly that my students would have heard about things like the migration crisis, about war and strife in the Middle East, and I wanted to take that on head on. I didn't want to shy away from difficult topics. I didn't want to teach about the trauma of war and revolution through the discussion of governments and their pawns as if playing a strategic game of chess, as political and military history is often taught. But I rather wanted to focus on the very human stories that were coming out of the region. Each of these crises or traumatic points in history deals with migration, the expulsion of people, the trauma that comes with war and surviving war, and I wanted students to understand that this is not a history that they're only supposed to read in newspapers, though they may and often do, of course, but one that I wanted them to feel and humanize on a personal level. I did this with the small hope that the next time they hear statistics on the news, they might take a step back and think about the people beyond the numbers. This is especially important to me as I teach in the US. The Muslim ban came out only a couple years ago, and it's already affected immigration patterns to the United States. The ongoing refugee crisis is something I know my students would have heard about, but not really had much time or space to think about it in their daily lives, and I wanted to create a space for that. I think it's helpful for this discussion for me to know what kind of classroom I'm teaching in. I teach at an elite small liberal arts college where the overwhelming majority of the students are white and come from extremely affluent backgrounds. The college is ranked as one of the most expensive small liberal arts colleges in the US, and the majority of students arrive on campus with no financial aid. In the first few weeks of my teaching, one of my students asked me a question that caught me off guard only for how basic it was. And I asked my students if they had ever met someone from the Middle East before, not including myself. And even though I hadn't discussed it with them, I knew my students had assumed at least that I was Middle Eastern, as my name is clearly foreign and I wear a scarf, which is a visible marker commonly associated, of course, with the Middle East. One of my students revealed that she had a Syrian grandparent who had come to the US in the 1920s. Another student shared that a Syrian refugee family had been relocated into his high school district a few years prior, but none of the others had ever interacted or even met a Middle Easterner before. So the stakes of humanizing this region became doubly important for me as an educator. But I also wanted them to learn about how to read these sources like a historian, not to reject them, but to respect them as serious sources in their own right. I wanted them to look for shifts in movement, shifts in time and place, how gutters affect how particular moments in various frames are told, how characters are abstracted and therefore amplified, and to push that further, make them look at how each story is constructed. What is the architecture of the story? Were they dealing with their own memories? Were they drawing upon family stories? Were they referencing family albums or research trips? Or were they reading the government missives and letters and the things that I had actually tried to avoid assigning as primary sources in the class? It was helpful that my 4 books were so different in this regard. Lissa is based on Shirin Hamdi and Coleman May's anthropological research and involves composites of various people from their fieldwork. Persepolis and A Game for Swallows are both autobiographical accounts from the author's childhoods, although Persepolis extends over Satrapi's entire life, while A Game for Swallows packs an enormous amount of detail into one long night in Zaina Abi Rashid's memories. And Badawi is based on Layla Abdul Razak's father and his memories that he had passed down to her. So all 4 books in this regard are very different and made that a very rich source of discussion for my students. In addition to all of this, I wanted my students to be able to craft a non-traditional research paper. I asked them to pick one of the 4 historical moments or issues: the Egyptian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, the Lebanese Civil War, and the Palestinian refugee crisis, and to research it and propose a graphic novel about that moment from the point of view of a character that we had not heard from yet. So for example, in Lissa, they read about Anna and Layla, 2 young women, one who grows up in the US and is American, and the other a Bawab's daughter from a Muslim family who goes to medical school. I challenged my students to consider what stories were not being told in these novels, to research those, and to come up with their own understanding of what those stories would have looked like, in an effort to make this landscape come even more alive for them, and to make sure that they understand that this is not a homogeneous space and that diversity lives here. This was especially important for me when considering the popularity of Persepolis as a book. At my university alone, at least 4 different classes teach Persepolis as a part of their curriculum, and often flatten the story as representative as either a Muslim girl story or representative of an Iranian story or what have you. But Satrapi's family is, as she describes in the novel, an affluent, upper-class, secular, communist family. Her story is representative of a swath of society, but not all of society, and by no means all Muslim women. It was important for me that the students understood how to read these stories as valuable without overstating their applicability in the specifics. And likewise, I didn't want people to take Zaina Abi Rashid's book as the only voice talking about the Lebanese Civil War, and pairing it with Layla Abdul Razak's book was very useful for contextualizing the broader implications of the Civil War in this respect. In this sense, the characters from the novels were really the first people that the class engaged with in a meaningful way. And in so connecting with these characters, the characters really gained the students' trust, so to speak. In the comics class, I asked my students to reread 2 pages of Satrapi's Persepolis, and these 2 pages focus on the Rex Theater fire. The Rex Theater fire, which took place in August of 1978, was one of the milestones that led up to the revolution. Accounts say anywhere between 400 to 800 people had died in a fire in the southern Iranian city of Abadan. And the only conclusive facts from the reports was that somehow someone or a group of people had locked the doors of the theater, started a fire, and left everyone inside to perish. About 100 people escaped, but really the overwhelming majority of people died in that night. The Iranian government said that it was the work of revolutionaries and condemned the terrorists. But as you can see here, Marjana Satrapi and others disillusioned with the government believed that the government had done this to its own people. I had the students reread these pages, and then I had them read a Washington Post article from August 21st, 1978, just days after the fire, where this American journalist basically repeats what the Iranian government had said, blaming the fire on terrorist revolutionaries. I told the students that there was no comprehensive proof of who had done the fire, who was responsible, and I asked them to vote on who they thought had been to blame. And all of them voted in favor of Satrapi's story and blamed it on the on the Iranian government, and not the revolutionaries. This was extremely interesting for me, because in traditional history classes, students will often discount the voices of individual sources in favor of official documents or government reports or even something like a textbook. And in this particular case, a few years ago, the Iranian government actually came out and said that the Rex Theater fire was the work of pro-Islamic Republic revolutionaries. This only means that Marjana Satrapi's version was actually incorrect. So I let that sit for a few weeks. I didn't want to disabuse them of their trust in Satrapi or her character quite yet, and I waited until the end of the semester to let them know that actually Satrapi's discussion of the fire was not particularly accurate in regards to the cause of it, but it was rather helpful for understanding how people reacted to the fire and how it became a motivating factor behind the revolution. Having had that connection with the character, however, my students were still able to see the value of Satrapi's story. None of them said that this was an invaluable story because she had made an erroneous remark, for example. And this wasn't just true of Marjan and her character in Persepolis, but really almost all of the characters. My students absolutely loved Zainal Abu Rashid's character, Ernest, to whom the book is dedicated to. They came to class saying things like, "I feel like I knew him," or "I just know who he is, I get him," just based on Abu Rashid's pointed descriptions and captivating illustration of him. Ernest is definitely a character, so to speak, but his relatability, plus the other characters, made the entire story and the war so much more real for my students. It wasn't just Ernest who brought the books alive for the students, it was the entire medium itself, and how in all of these stories, the main characters are either children or young adults, people that we don't usually hear from in historical accounts. As one of my students pointed out, in history, we often hear what the adults think about a particular situation, whether it's politicians or professors or whoever else. But in these books, we saw the world through the perspective of children. In A Game for Swallows in particular, Zaina and her brother almost never speak out loud except to play games and sing songs. Instead, they absorb what's being said around them, which is exactly how we are supposed to understand the war as well. We, as the children, have to acknowledge that we don't necessarily understand everything that's going on in the Middle East, but have to listen to those who understand it better rather than trying to be the loudest voices, analyzing this treaty or that public speech. And it was with that that I felt like my job had been done. Thank you all so much for your time and for bearing with this recording. I would love to be in touch, so I've left my contact information for you here. Thank you all so much again.
Hello. Well, thank you, Bita, for that, if we're recording, because I think it was amazing. Her perspective is super interesting on teaching through comics. Yes, I'm going to introduce you. And if you're interested, her contact was there if you'd like to give her comments or ask her questions. Our next wonderful speaker is Diala Brisley. Woo! Is a Syrian visual artist and comics artist and illustrator, currently focusing on spotlighting the educational situation of Syrian children or Syrian kids. She started her own initiative making murals in the refugee camps to support alternative education centers, and she also makes artwork to empower women's voices in war and peace. Diala came here from France with great difficulty because of her status as a refugee. And so she had to actually inform us of the process of getting her the visa to allow her into Lebanon as a Syrian, which was a complicated thing that took the work of 7 people to manage.
And they investigated me in the airport.
And they investigated. Okay, I think it's a good idea if she tells us about that. So, full screen?
Do you want to pick which one?
No, let's go full screen.
Which do you want?
What do you want to start with?
Oh, this, for example. But yeah,
Yes.
anyway.
Can tell us a little bit about her background?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. I think my voice is really loud now. I started to work as an artist in Syria in an animation company. It was Spacetoon channel, very famous in Middle East. But I wasn't satisfied at all because like all the subjects, they were really shallow and there was no depth in it. So I always had a frustration, but we lived under a dictatorship, so we didn't have a voice as an artist or anyone else. So when the revolution started in 2011, I felt like I really have to be involved there, but I didn't start by my art because I thought like art couldn't like really help in this situation. So I was preparing field hospitals and things and going to protest. But then when the situation became like really hard, I left Syria in 2013. So there I couldn't do anything. I couldn't volunteer or work on anything. So I started like working on illustration to support like political reports and things. So I found like people that they really found it like really interesting, and they pay more attention for the events and what is happening. But I was still frustrated as well because I thought it's not enough, especially like I was communicating with someone from a Free Syrian Army, and he was telling me, yeah, it's really nice what you are doing, but it's really fragile and you can't really do any change with art. And in that moment, I felt like, yeah, he's really right. So, so I decided to move back to Lebanon and help to support alternative education here in refugee camps. Especially, they really had a lack of education, and most of the kids, they had to work to support their families. So I thought, I wanted to know, follow up with why kids, they don't go to school. Because the refugees situation in Lebanon, they can't really work, and it's not allowed for them even to move. And fathers, they can't really go out of their tents, so they are like kind of free prisoners. So they have to send their like wives and their kids to work instead. So that really, and anyway, the kids, they were not allowed to go to most of the schools in Lebanon. So that's really like pushed me more to work with kids and encourage them more to go to school tents, which is something that a lot of activists, they invented in refugee camps. They started doing school tents to provide alternative education. Now I moved to France, and I feel like this kind of guilt feeling goes back and forth, and I don't know how to deal with it. So now I try to work on comics and illustration books to just explain their situation in these refugee camps. And like, of course, I always feel like I have two kind of people, like audience that I go to. The Syrian kids themselves and the other people outside. So when I go with kids, like Syrian kids, I always try to put like really very positive messages, so to encourage them to be stronger and to try to do something from their situation, because we really can't get them out of this situation. But at least we can help them to be stronger and try to create something in the same environment. And when I go to the other audience, I like to put spotlight on their horrible situation. It's not the same view, of course. So I remember I met someone who's Italian in Europe, and he told me, I don't know why he told me these things. He told me like, you don't look like a refugee, and you are just a drop in the ocean trying to change the world by your art. So I was thinking like, yeah, I'm a drop in the ocean. I don't want to be a mountain, but I think if we are a lot of drop in the ocean, we can make a big ocean. We will be the ocean, and we can help people. So because I worked a lot with kids, so I feel like I understand exactly how is the situation in refugee camps. So it was easier for me to work on comics that talk about their situation. This is from Iraq, but I think we have very similar experience. Like kids, they try their hard to be business people in a refugee camp to make money. which is not easy. Like some of the books, they talk they are inspired by Syrian kids there, but just to raise awareness about health care, so kids, they can really take care of themselves because there is not enough medical centers there. Yeah, that's it. Ah, okay.
To show some.
Ah, okay. So this Bukra, inshallah, we were a group of artists, and what I did, we went all of us to the field and to interview people there. So what I did, I interviewed many families, but in the end, I created a story based on all of them. I wanted to talk about how is men, they could be really traumatized as well. Because like most of the organizations, they really take care of women and kids, but they forget about men, that they can be also traumatized. And as I said before, they can't really move, and they are really stuck in their refugee camp, in their tent. So they have this frustration, and they have to send their kids instead to work, which is like could hurt all of the family. So yeah, I was concentrating on how what is the difficulties that men, they can really face, like there's just because they are Syrian men and they are refugees, like they immediately people, they think they are ISIS. Anyway, I've been called ISIS 5 times here in Lebanon while I'm having my glass of whiskey. So which is normal. But for men, it's really stronger just because they are men. I know when I talk to kids, I heard from kids a lot that they hear their fathers crying in their room, since the walls, they are just like a piece of fabric, so they can hear all the conversation between parents, and they can hear them crying. So I think like this is also show many difficulties. That's why kids, they don't go to school. Now I'm concentrating mostly on supporting alternative education. Actually, I think it's a big need, because like now we can't really change anything in a political situation, and I know we are, like as I said, we are dropped in the ocean, and we can't really change the political situation, but at least we can support kids. Thank you.
And thank you for coming all the way from France. He's still sleepy. Well, you never sleep, that's why. Okay, our next wonderful speaker is Tanya Boski. Am I saying it right? She's a clinical psychologist and assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at AUB, at the American University of Beirut. She completed a postdoctoral research on ethnicity, migration, and childhood trauma. We'd like to welcome you here today. This is the title of the talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You have to help me with Mac.
Yes. Sure. Thank you. Hey, wait, let's just keep the title. Yeah. No, I just want to open it. Okay. Tanya's title, since it disappeared, was Sumud, using comics to disseminate research on coping with children affected. Oh, thank you. Sorry.
I'll help. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be here and really humbled to be here, especially to speak. So I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm used to going to conferences that are really medical, psychological. So this is really a breath of fresh air for me, and to be in a room with so many creative people. So today, I'm going to be talking about Sumud, a comic book that I developed to try to disseminate some of my psychological research for children and adolescents affected by war and conflict. And really the motivation was to try to get out of this academic funk that we get into as psychologists, where we just publish in academic journals and we're not really sharing knowledge with people that it could actually help. So before I start, I just wanted to give some acknowledgements and thanks to people who've helped me in this project. So I'm really not an illustrator by trade, I'm a psychologist, and so people, faculty and students at AUB and in Italy have really helped me on this. So I'm going to start by talking a bit about the research that led to this project, and then I'll focus on the comic book itself and a pilot of the comic book. So firstly, the research. So we know from research that children and adolescents are obviously affected by war and conflict in terms of their psychological well-being and distress. So they have higher prevalence rates of a range of clinical disorders, including post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and then other kinds of symptoms externalizing, internalizing, so things like challenging behaviors and self-harm, as well as obviously affecting their overall well-being. And there are lots of interventions that have been developed and tested in this context to try to mitigate some of those effects. So a bit like we were just hearing, that we can't change what would really help children, which is the conflict and insecurity, but there may be things that we can do as psychologists to try to mitigate the effects. And that's where my work has been. So with my colleagues in Northern Ireland, we conducted a review of these interventions. And what we found was that for non-clinical populations, so meaning populations that do not necessarily have a clinical diagnosis but are still living in this context or are still affected, the evidence was just really poor. There's just not very many good quality studies. And they tend to be classroom-based, and they don't have that many effects, but they do have effects for well-being in general and for hope, which are really important in these contexts. And then for clinical populations, so people with clinical diagnosis, PTSD, depression, anxiety, or other disorders, there is better evidence, better quality evidence and more of it. And so things like group trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, other forms of cognitive behavioral therapy, narrative exposure therapy, these really kind of one-to-one manualized interventions had good effectiveness for a range of clinical outcomes. So what's really kind of typical about these kinds of results is that it's really biased towards making a conclusion that what's effective in these populations are these one-to-one, very clinically orientated interventions. And this is really kind of typical. And it's based on the fact that the research and the evidence is geared a certain way. So what we end up with is the literature in my field being dominated by these kinds of interventions, one-to-one, office-based. And this doesn't reflect the field. It doesn't reflect what is happening in the field. So interventions in the field tend to be more responsive to actual need. So the fact that we can't provide one-to-one interventions for an entire affected population, we don't necessarily have the kind of training or human resources to do that. We don't necessarily have the facilities to do that. And so they tend to be much more classroom or community-based interventions that reflect that need. But that's not in the literature. This is not what we read about in the literature. So with my colleague Bassam Marshoud, who I worked with in Palestine, we developed a kind of different methodology to try to answer a bit more and to develop the literature a bit more to respond to this massive gap in the literature. So what we decided to do was, rather than looking at these very neat manualized interventions, we widened it to look just at the mechanisms of what works in these interventions. How do these interventions help, regardless of what they're called or what the theory they're based on? How can these interventions help the well-being and mental health of children affected by conflict? So what's different about this is that we're looking trans-theoretically, so we're not basing this on particular branded interventions, but also that we included grey literature or unpublished literature. So we're not looking for these high-quality randomized controlled trials. We were looking at program evaluations and reports, people working in the field, governments, all of these kinds of organizations that could help us to get a sense of, in a qualitative sense, of what is happening and what is helpful. So the first thing that we found is that we had much better scope for the research that was done. It was covering a much wider area. So the countries in yellow are those where there's been some conflict and there has been studies done. Still some limitations. So the red countries are those where there hasn't been research done, and Syria is included in there. And what we also found was a whole wealth of mechanisms that were not reflected in the rest of the literature. So on the far right, you can see the treatment, and so this is what's really covered really well. But there are two other categories. One is about the promotion of well-being, and the other is about the prevention of mental disorders. And there's a whole range of mechanisms there that are not necessarily packaged in interventions in the way that they are usually in the literature. So this involves things like play and having a normal routine, and having family support and support for parents and families, community strengthening, access to schools and education, and other things like problem solving and trauma processing. So these came through really strong in our results in these other levels of intervention. And they also came through that we had some moderate to high quality evidence. So there is evidence there, it's just not necessarily published or packaged in a way that it gets through in my field. So now I'm going to talk about what we did with this. So firstly, we published it. This is what we do as psychologists. We publish it in academia in a peer-reviewed journal. But it's really not very rewarding because who's going to read it? I mean, and is it really going to get translated into the field? Is it going to help anyone? I mean, this is what we wanted to do. So this is how I came up with this idea of, well, let's find a way, some kind of accessible format that could give access to children and adolescents to this knowledge, to these findings, and not just to the public, but directly to the people that this could help. And this is how Samud, the comic book, was born. So here she is. So this is Samud. And so this comic book is essentially follows the story of this adolescent girl and her younger brother. And the idea of it is to translate the main themes of the research into an accessible narrative. So all of the narratives, the dialogue, the events, even the choice of characters is based on trying to communicate something from the research. So the fact even that I have two different age groups, an older girl and a younger boy, is to demonstrate how different age groups can manifest their symptoms of trauma and difficulties in different ways. So I'm going to give you some examples of how I tried to translate the research into this comic book format. So firstly, one of the things that came through most strongly in the research is about the importance of family, systemic support, community support, family strengthening. So throughout the book, it is not focused on this one individual. She has a wider family, a wider network, and she has really good friends. She also has difficulties. She has symptoms, as we would say as a psychologist, and I focused the symptoms around a nightmare, which was a nice visual way of describing a symptom. So she has this recurrent nightmare of a shark that causes her anxiety, and she experiences anxiety throughout the day. So this is, again, trying to demonstrate how different people can feel anxiety, so things like heart beating faster, sweating, all of the kinds of things that I'm feeling right now presenting to you, and trying to normalize and show how this can feel. She also feels hypervigilant, so she feels like the shark is kind of following her around, and this is a feeling that children will often experience when they're in these surroundings or experiencing these kind of symptoms. But when she has support from friends or family, or when she reaches out to friends and family and others in her network, then this feeling reduces, so the shark moves away as she reaches out and talks to her friend. And again, this is replicating what we found in the research about the importance of family support and peer support. Another example here is of particular techniques. So I tried to include in this book particular techniques that are known to help and have evidence for helping with these symptoms. So for example, in the bottom right hand for you corner, her best friend Faha is teaching her how to try to breathe slowly when you're feeling anxious in order to regulate your physiological reactions. So these are techniques that we use with children and adolescents all the time. So blowing bubbles can be really helpful to show how you need to slow your breathing. If you try to blow a bubble really fast, it's not going to work. And also the square breathing technique. And then there's some psychoeducation there about like how the body reacts in a kind of fight-flight scenario, trying to use the metaphor of the shark to describe visually and more accessibly this experience and this knowledge. So in the narrative, I try to show how positive this can be, but also that there are limitations to this. We have to accept that there are limitations to this advice too, and also to normalize that that's okay. They work sometimes, not always, and that some things work better for some things than others. So in this example, regulating your breathing and regulating your physical arousal is going to be helpful in the moment, but it's not necessarily going to get rid of the nightmare. It's not going to get to treat those symptoms. So the recurring nightmare, the shark comes back again and again. And so essentially the book then follows a narrative in which Samud is supported or reaches out to different characters, different people in her life who help her to understand her symptoms, to understand her situation, and to give advice and support to try to help her. So in this example, she reaches out to a teacher who gives her some understanding of what this shark might represent, who explores a little bit the kinds of difficulties that she's facing, some of the negative adverse events that she's experienced throughout her life, some related to conflict, but others even within the home, so things like marital discord, domestic violence that can affect children all over the world, regardless of whether or not they're affected by their war or conflict in their environment. And this helps her to understand the kind of symbolism behind dreams. She also gives her some psychoeducation around Samud's tendency to want to avoid and not think about the difficulties around her. So this is a really common technique that we use with children and adolescents, actually also adults, to understand how that technique that can make you feel better in the short term, but it doesn't really make the problem go away. I've done this in black and white. Usually I say a pink elephant, but to save costs, I've done it in black and white, so I just put roller skates on him. And so if I asked you now to just not think about an elephant on roller skates, most of you, the first thing that will pop into your head is an elephant on roller skates, which demonstrates how this is not a helpful technique, and how actually we need to be able to try to face the difficulties that are going on and the difficult memories. So another character that I introduce is a counselor, a school counselor, and in order to try to explain in some more depth some of the psychoeducation and mechanisms that we found in the research. So he uses a lot of metaphors, and I tried to pick as many metaphors that I've used with children before to really convey this visually. So this is an example of how the brain processes difficult memories. So usually in a laundry basket, you put your laundry. When it gets full, you put it in the washing machine. But if there's just too much washing, then it just starts to spill over. And this is what can happen with memories, that or if we're overwhelmed by something that's happened, it can intrude into our consciousness, unlike other memories that are processed. And so the metaphor continues into the washing machine, where we need to be able to try and wash those dirty clothes, and that's easy when it's just a small amount, but when it's a lot, the washing machine can find that really difficult, the washing machine being our brains. And so what we can do to try to help that is to break things down into small pieces, pay attention to each bit, and wash it a little bit at a time. Again, just to give another example, so this is psychoeducation around how anxiety works and about avoidance and trying to stay in the moment when anxiety is triggered. So as part of this process, one of the really strong mechanisms in the literature is about trauma processing. So this is paying attention to difficult memories and thinking through them and talking about them with loved ones. So Samud does this throughout the book, and I've pulled in as many family and friends that I can into this to show how important that normalizing with family and using family supports is really helpful for the well-being of children and adolescents. I also include a narrative on the younger child to demonstrate, as I said, how younger children can present slightly differently. So he may not be able to describe a dream that he's had or describe anxiety symptoms, but a younger child may have behavioral difficulties, more tantrums, bedwetting, that kind of thing. I'm just going to skip over that. Okay, so I wanted to show that these things can be really helpful, and that's what the evidence indicates. So her symptoms improve. So the shark leaves her alone sometimes, and she sleeps well. But of course, the reality, and that's what's quite different about this population, is that it's not that that things are suddenly better. It's not that perfect, and things can still happen. We're still in an ongoing situation that there's very much real threats, ongoing threats in their environment. So I had to make sure that we just didn't wrap this up as this kind of neat story where, oh, let's do these psychological interventions and now everything's fine. So I had to have something happen to show this, that resilience is not just about kind of immunity to these difficulties, but it's just about trying to handle things a different way. So in the narrative, her best friend dies, and she has a return of her symptoms. And again, this is about demonstrating that this can happen and that's okay. And there's a portion of the book that allows Sumud to grieve and to feel sad, and that's also okay. And this came through in the more qualitative part of the research, to be able for parents to allow and support grief and loss and difficulties and strong emotions, and for children to be normalized with that experience. But at the same time, I also try to remind the reader about the strategies that they have and the healthy coping mechanisms that they have that they can use to stay afloat and to ask for help and to fight back. And so by the end of the book, what I hope that the reader is at a point where they can see that these are things that could help, but that they can still, experience difficulties, but at least get some relief. So that's the book, and I just want to finish to talk a little bit about the pilot that I'm working on now. So this is a book that I developed as an adult and as a European, and I wanted to make sure that the narrative is accessible to the people I actually want it to be accessible for. So I've planned focus groups with adolescents in Lebanon who have been affected by conflict and adversity, to ask them, to give them the book, to ask them whether they understand it, whether it's accessible, whether it's interesting, enjoyable. Is there things that it could be, either could improve it, or are there things that it doesn't talk about that actually would be helpful to know more about? And I'm also going to test it for psychoeducational value, like do people really learn, does it improve symptoms, do people use these techniques and does it help? And that's what I'm working on now. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tanya.
I'll take my tissues.
I hope we didn't put you through any nightmares. I think that's very valuable research, and I think that you should also, on a future project, Tanya, work with Diala or others. I think there's much space for this kind of work to be out there. And when you get the results, Tanya, I'll be very interested in the focus group. I mean, not just me, but others. Thank you. Today, now we have Mira Almir. She's, okay, I'll talk about Mira before I read your title. Mira's a researcher, a visual artist, which is quite a wonderful combination. She's a co-founder of the Research by Comics that translates complex research and academic concepts into accessible Arabic comics, and co-founder of Space 27, a feminist art space / work studio. Mira does, just to make it a little more clear, Mira draws comics, but she's also an academic and researcher. So I'd like to welcome her here today. Thank you. Our work is in the exhibition too.
Oh.
These lovely ladies are here to help time you, like 5 minutes are left.
Okay.
Nobody's seeing them.
Nobody's seeing them, so I can ignore them. Wait. Okay. Okay. So I'm gonna talk a bit about gender in general, and just gonna start by saying something that I think everyone knows, and gender is a social construct, right? So it means it's created. Yeah. It's created by and within the societies. So it's normal that when a person leaves that society or when a community moves, the norms it has created will change. That's true, like that has always been true. It has been true for American women artists who went to France in the 19th century. And it's true for people who are in forced migrations or, like refugees. So evidently, it's reflected in the many comics on the refugee crisis in the region, whether it's explicitly mentioned or not. I'm going to talk about a lot about comics that were done on and by Syrian refugees in Lebanon mostly, although I do use some other references. And now can you hear me? Yes. Okay. One thing is that when we talk about gender, we tend to think immediately of women. And of course, gender is not limited to women. It's the whole construction that, that separates people into men and women and ascribes certain roles to men and others to women. And however, in the comics that I've seen, and well, in a lot of the reports and information that we have about refugees, that separation is like put forth. And so excuse me if it's going to be very binary and heteronormative and all that. And we can think together about why that is in those comics in particular. So since we're talking about women and men, of course, but like I'm going to start with women. And so I'm going to start with the women who come alone, who travel alone, or with their families. And a lot of the comics start with when they leave Syria. And so we see lots of examples of women who travel alone, whether it's because their husbands have moved before them, like came to Lebanon before them, or did not want to leave, or had disappeared or passed away, or been killed in the war. So 30% of, more than 30% of the households actually, of refugee households, are headed by women. In Lebanon, because we're a very racist country and because we did not, taking responsibility here, because there is no refugee status, we have a huge number of people who don't have papers. And so men find it more difficult to travel within the country because they would be stopped and asked for their IDs, which meant that women have more freedom to move around. And this had led to some specific roles that women have taken on and more freedom that they have than men, be it in settlements, camps, or in the city itself. Which means that women find it easier to work. I feel like I'm telling a story done by other people, like lots of other people. So that's cool. So women find it easier to work because they're questioned less when they want to travel, and because they get paid less a lot of the time. And children too, of course. But however, they do work a lot in jobs that they are not trained for and jobs that they probably would not have picked otherwise. So for example, this woman is telling us that she ended up cleaning houses, and it weighs on her. And the woman in the drawing by Lena Merhij is talking about how she is working in agriculture even though she gets judged for it. There's also the fact that NGOs are implementing lots of programs for women in particular. And they tend to help women more. They call it economic empowerment of marginalized people, or and so you end up having also women who take on, like, become entrepreneurial, or who have to go and get the aid from the NGOs. Well, lots of those comics are done by or commissioned by NGOs. And those that aren't, they are also often done through anthropological research, which means that we often frame the question of gender within the family. And like this, that's the artist who did this, asking about the relationship between the men and the women in the family. And men tend to have, well, often have negative responses which reaffirm their control on women and reimagine traditions or the way things were. However, gender norms change all the time, whether it's because of a crisis or just because of time, and like they're always changing. However, in refugee situations, people tend to idealize the life they left behind, and they tend to idealize a certain imagination of traditions, which means that they often tend to reframe women as the fact that they should be in the house, even if that's not always the case in Syria in particular. Well, before I get to this, comics, since they're often done through interviews, they're often done in the homes. And so we are given an insight, let's say, into the domestic realm and into the private life of men and women alike. I love that, that panel because it kind of made me question. We often, in gender studies, we often talk about the male gaze, and now, like when I saw this, it made me question my personal gaze looking at those stories. She's actually saying, dear Lebanese, you are witnessing live a discussion around what has become the honor of the Syrian woman. Some of the characters represented in the comics do say that those ideas, those gender norms, like there is no time for that now, or like there are way more important things. But it also, like being in the house, it also, and drawn, it also gives us, shows us situations that we otherwise would not be invited to see, probably, that photos, for example, would not do. I don't know how you feel about that. I personally don't know how I feel about it. It also shows us men in situations we would not normally see. So we do see men in vulnerable states. And that's something that Bell Hooks talks about, the patriarchal self-esteem, which is the idea that men's self-esteem in patriarchal societies, which is like all societies basically, comes from like their work bringing in money for the house, like taking care of their families. And as refugees, they are not able to do that. In this scene, we see, in particular, a family where the women are given opportunities to work, and the man struggles with that. The men in this and lots of other comics and are kind of confined into small spaces because they don't have that freedom to move. So they're the ones pushed into the house. You would think that that means that gender roles for men would change. However, sexism is built on the idea that capitalist sexism in particular does not encourage us to look at the underlying problems, but it kind of wants to push women back into the homes and doesn't encourage men in particular to share in the emotional labor. So for example, this person actually says it in a way. This person cannot work, the man cannot work, and his wife is young, and the interviewer, who is also the artist, asks him, why wouldn't she do the work? And he says, no, she doesn't want to leave the kids, but and she's actually saying, no, he's the one who doesn't want to do it. Because obviously, the fact that women are leaving the house doesn't mean that the men are taking on their responsibilities. So women are still doing the emotional labor, so for example, taking care of all members of the family, and they're still making the coffee. There is so much coffee making in comics. Whether it's the ones in Syria and the one that's coffee, or the ones done about refugees here. But women are also participating in political life. Not saying that does not happen in their their communities back home, but in the ways refugee settlements are organized, women are taking on responsibilities and taking care of political decisions in the sense that politics is the way we organize our lives together. However, we have to be careful when reading those comics not to generalize what a Syrian refugee is or what the Syrian original gender roles are. And what I'm saying about Syrians, I think it applies to everyone. So for example, there are comics that show us that women who had jobs there. There are comics that are talking about women who are not even married, for example, and the way their lives have changed. I have less than 5 minutes left. A few things we don't see a lot of in comics are, but that are that we know happen are, for example, sex work. So when we talk about women's work, we tend to gloss over sex work in comics in particular, because NGO reports tend to talk about that a bit more, but no real studies. And gender-based violence. Oh, yeah. So this is about actually, in that scene, the community was discussing ways to prevent, the people who want to exploit them. And some of those people, like, for example, this woman who came in with her hijab, like her nizami hijab, like the way it should be. I don't know how to say it in English. Nizami. Well, it turns out that she was actually the head of a prostitution network. So she was coming in innocently, but wanted to recruit vulnerable women. And the fact that there is a lot of gender-based violence, which we tend to gloss over. Lots of those comics are commissioned by NGOs. This is not a comic. This in particular is just like a series of illustrations commissioned by NGOs. I'm going to take 1 minute to do a small advertisement for tomorrow's Women's March. Because this year we're addressing the idea of economic justice, and economic justice is, as we've seen, economy is something that is challenging and heavily affecting and affected by gender. So please join us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the wonderful panelists. May you please join me here for questions from the audience. So Mira, Tanya, Bita can't be here, and Diala. We would have liked to Skype in Bita. Unfortunately, Lebanon's Wi-Fi is very slow. But otherwise, I'll get you the mics, and the panel is open for questioning. I'll get you the mic.
Run. I apologize. I know, I apologize. I have a question for Mira. Hi. My question is I was very curious about, have you been looking at the research of Shireen El-Feki, who's doing surveys of big groups of men in Palestine, Lebanon, Egypt, Kuwait, and it's, I don't know if you, are you familiar with Shireen El-Feki's work?
I haven't looked at that work?
It's
No.
a new, well, it's relatively like, I guess it's like over a year old now, or less than that. And she's been doing it for Promundo, which is a Brazilian NGO that has a big interest in men. But what was interesting to me was that El Feki had come from, you know her work, Sex in the Citadel. So she was really looking at women for a very long time. And then she said that she felt that the women had the more interesting stories, and they were more interesting to hang out with, and they were more fun. But really, the fixing of society, you had to go look at the men. So I was just sort of curious about when you were talking, gender as a construct, definitely. But I was just sort of interested about that balance and like you prefer one over the other or they're together.
Well, Shireen Fek in her work in general tends to be very essentialist. And
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last thing you
well,
said.
tends to be very essential, like, well, you know, like dividing people in that binary and through, like, you know, roles that they should embody. But and my personal approach says that we should destroy gender. However, that the idea of looking at men's experiences and addressing them, I think Bell Hooks again says that feminists have failed men. I don't know how much I agree with that, but it is very important to see those experiences and the changes that are happening to their roles and how we can go from there in order to destroy gender.
Can I ask another question? I'm sorry. Can I just ask one more? Dalia, I was very curious about the use of color in your comics, because I definitely noticed when you were the notebook of men's experience, definitely the colors change as opposed to the children's experiences that are very rich, not all pastel colors, but the green, the pink. And I was sort of curious if you could, or I was wondering if you could talk about the use of color in your work, what it signifies. Is it only for mood, or is there I don't know, an aesthetics at work that you're honing in on?
Yeah. My experience working in the refugee camps here in Lebanon, I always felt like the biggest two colors is dust and the white tents. So I always, my visual memory about this refugee camps is like this. So even when I go there and I do murals for kids, they are really thirsty for any kind of like colors. So sometimes they just steal the paint from me and they put it in their hair, their face, their clothes and everything, because they spend a long time under the sun. So even their clothes, they lose their colors. So I always see this environment is like, it needs a lot of colors usually.
Thank you.
Did I answer?
Yeah.
I gathered, Tan, you're trying to be, I mean, I don't know, I hope so, but you're trying to be a bit disruptive in terms of how academia usually works. So I noticed the article was open access and the work that you're doing, and you were very critical in your talk about how nobody reads those peer-reviewed journals. They're very closed off. I don't know who access, like universities probably are the only ones who have access to them. So if you can talk a bit more about particularly your experience, like coming from Europe and working in a context that is here, and how you can still try to be disruptive of how the academic system works in terms of, so you're forced to publish in peer-reviewed journals because that goes into the promotion and the tenure, but at the same time, the gates to knowledge are closed off. Nobody has access to them except a very, like, it's an ivory tower. So if you can talk more about that experience, like particularly in the context of Lebanon or even the Arab region, And even with the experience that you've had now, I didn't quite understand your target audience. Was it to test this with the adolescents themselves, or to like? I was a bit confused as to who was your target audience with the book.
Me? Yes, there. Okay. Thank you for your questions. Yeah, so firstly, I think there was a study that found that like 20% of published literature gets actually read, and it's read by other academics in the same field. So this is really problematic for clinical psychologists. So my role is really part in community and part in academia, and it's really hard to do that actually, because in the clinical world, that's all you do, in the academic world, that's all you do. So matching those two things is really difficult here or elsewhere. I'm not sure it's that different. But in some ways, I think it's even been easier for me here because of some of the structural differences in provision of services and lack of mental health services in general. And so that gives some creativity to more grassroots projects to do things a bit differently. So that opens the doors for psychologists to have access to populations to do things a bit more in an innovative way. You don't have to go through massive bureaucratic structures necessarily. So for example, the pilot that I'm doing now is with the Family Guidance Centre, who are an NGO, a local NGO, and that's, I can just work with them, and I can have this idea, and we can work on it together, and we can develop it together. So there's more room for creativity. That's what I found here that I've really enjoyed. And I'm not sure that this project would have developed so quickly in the way that it did if I had been in Northern Ireland, for example, still. So there's massive benefits and advantages actually to that. There's many disadvantages, but that's one of the advantages. And then to answer your second question about the focus groups, I went over it really quickly there. But essentially what we're planning is that we want to make sure that this, before we kind of try and publish or print this book, I would like it to be kind of freely accessible, as with the research, open access. So I need to make sure that people understand it. Adolescents themselves who have experienced conflict, who have experienced adversity and disadvantage. And this is the population that is served by the Family Guidance Centre. So my idea is to have a number of different focus groups with both the adolescents and their families, because their families are implicated. And kind of, the book is for adolescents, but it's also a message for parents and communities to support adolescents. So I'd like it to be something that we read together, and then we ask them about what they think of the book and how we could do it better. And are there things, it really amazed me when I tried to do this in illustrations about how difficult that is and how many assumptions you make. Does she wear a scarf or not? How old should she be? Does she look that old? What should she wear? What does the street look like? I tried to make it kind of a little non-specific to one place, but that's really hard to do in a picture, and most of it looks like Palestine, which is what I used as a lot of the references. So that experience, I just really told me that, okay, there must be some European bias in here somewhere, and I need to make sure that the main messages are still communicated despite the biases of the person who's illustrating. So that's the main purpose, to talk to adolescents themselves.
I'm wondering if, I'm guessing the next panel would talk more about this, but since a lot of the work that's being done is through NGOs, I'm wondering if you could reflect a bit more about this idea, I think it was Arundhati who talked about it, the NGOization of resistance, and how having all of these NGOs is sort of sucking up all this resistance that could go into fighting systems and regimes and all of this. I really wish Beta could have been here. I would have wanted to talk to her, to ask her more about this. But I'm wondering if you could reflect more on how, in a way, you're part of the system, because this is the reality and you're trying to sort of create change, but from within. But this is still questionable as to the limits of how far we can go by changing from within without a critical disruption that happens. So I'm wondering if the three of you could talk a bit more, because all of you are somehow involved in it. And also, Mira, if you can talk a bit more about this push, no, I'm asking all of you, but
We think
at the end, like if Mira could talk a bit more about this, this push in a way to also disrupt in a way, I don't know, academia by pushing sort of this kind of work, the illustrations, the research by comics, and which is also what Tanya is trying to do, like this sort of making knowledge more accessible through this medium.
I will just talk very fast and give it to Mira. No, I'm kidding. So, like NGOs, mostly they have standards and they don't really like to talk about politics, but sometimes it's really very annoying because once like I drew something and I did the graffiti on the wall like حرية, freedom. And they said, oh yeah, everything is nice, but like, why you talk about politics? And I was like, freedom now is politics? Like, I was really shocked. So I told them I'm not going to remove it. So they accepted this in the end. But even with this Bukra Inshallah book, because I talked about like how like Lebanese army, they treat men and they call them ISIS, and they said like we don't know if we can publish this because it's like it's talking about politics again. But yeah, sometimes even if they have standards, you can really crush this, break these standards and put your own ideas. And freedom is not politics.
And it's basic. So when I was preparing this presentation, I started just taking note of all the comics that were done, that were commissioned by NGOs. And at some point I stopped. You had like Solidarité Internationale, which did Bukra Inshallah, but you also had Care Network, Norwegian People's Aid, Amnesty, UN agencies, like so many of them, ESRC, Médecins Sans Frontières, and you had like so many of those, which on one side you understand, like, on the one side that puts in resources to create those things, because you need money, like artists and like comics artists need to live. But on the other hand, it limits and kind of directs, curates what ends up being said. Which is why, for example, in research by comics, we're very conflicted about how to deal with money and how to create something that could be sustainable but not rely on NGO funding, for example. The NGO funding also means that, well, because there are sometimes calls for proposals for just like projects in general, they end up kind of giving you ideas on what to work on. And what approach to have for gender, for example. And you know, I personally, and I think all Lebanese people have that conflicting, like that really complex relationship with NGOs, because they're taking on the work that should be done by governments, that we would elect and kind of have oversight on it. But on the other hand, they are employing like so it's kind of, you know. Anyway, now with the funding starting to get a bit tricky, who knows what will happen. As for the academia, that idea that 20% of the academic articles are read by other people in the field, only those are read and they're read by people in the field. Think about when we're talking about the region, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and all that. They are very rarely written in Arabic. When they are, it's in a complex Arabic. They are often translated, not just in academia, but in reports and all that. They are often translated from English. The academics tend to work in foreign institutions. Like, for example, I am doing my PhD in France. So because of lots of reasons, lots of people end up working or at least studying there and publishing there. So our idea in Research by Comics was to take research done by people who are here, that is done on us in our community, in our society, and to try and give it back to ourselves in a way that would be accessible. So, because the whole point of doing research for most of the people who do research is to actually change something, like to help us understand how we can change things to the better. And so we need to actually tell the people what we found in order for it to matter. So yeah, that's what we're doing in Research by Comics, and I think we should talk and we should talk. Oh, you have
I just wanted to add something. I totally agree with from the academic perspective, but maybe also from the clinical perspective, because this is one of my major frustrations of working clinically in general with socially disadvantaged communities who are more affected by mental health problems. And the reason for that is because social disadvantage and inequality and injustice has a massive effect on our well-being and the rate of mental disorders that we experience. And so as psychologists, I get very frustrated that so many of our interventions are one-to-one. And maybe if you're lucky, you will involve family members, but they very rarely try to advocate or change the structures that are causing the problems in the first place. And this is really a massive frustration of mine in general in my field. And so I hope that we can push perhaps by like this kind of interdisciplinary way of working to try to change the way we think about these interventions and at least have some other influence in advocacy, at least, that these injustices are the causal problems and not just something overarching that we just can't even touch.
Well, thank you so much. We have one last panel, guys. You have a short 10-minute break so we can finish by 6. So thank you very much for being here today. Yes, very inspiring, very interesting. Coffee break, everyone. Come back quick.